shop. There are books for sale. Some of the Hope Collective books that we issued for the NHS in England, and clearly there's a slight irony into Dublin punk rockers raising money for the British medical system, but we thought so many of the bands that we loved were from England, and it would be a nice statement to make. And then there's our book and our fanzine to raise money for the Irish Red Cross Ukrainian Crisis Appeal. So thanks very much for the people who've written for that, who've bought it. And we will be doing, if you're on our mailing list, you'll know about our next chat. Okay, so our next chat, if you're around, is Monday the 3rd of March. Same place. Reserve your stool now. And the next one has a theme, and we're looking at entertainment officers. We're looking at people who were students, who were often a member of a union of students, who really transformed Ireland by putting on gigs, by cool, innovative bands, by getting students organised to go and support those bands, and obviously Elvera is the absolute exemplar. But after Elvera's example, there were others. So we'll be doing a whole evening to 2 full panels of people who were ENTS officers, just getting their stories of how did they bring bands to Ireland, what did they do, and hopefully there's lessons for other people who are going to get involved in DIY. But speaking of DIY, I was struck by some of the points that Elvera made. And one is, if any of you young people tonight are thinking, oh yeah, maybe I'll put on a gig. Like, before you do, I just want you to consider that Elvera was doing that when she was 12. And if you think, oh, I've got a great social life, I go out dancing. I don't know, a lot of you look like you're skilled dancers, so I imagine you go out quite a lot. But Elvera was 16, she was doing 4 nights a week. So, the bar has been raised. It's not all positivity from the stage. It's kind of marking where you are in your life. So we've got our 3rd member of the second panel, and we all, Bernie, I think every time we do something, you're kind of the first person we ask, and you haven't said no yet. So we you've got a few vetoes up your sleeve, but we don't take it for granted, and we're delighted, because any of you who saw Bernie on stage will have felt what I felt, and it was, gosh, there's a woman in a band in Ireland, which was strange enough, but it was someone who was cool and didn't look like they were trying to be a rock star, but who looked like the people in the bands from England and America that we love. So thank you for being that person. And
thank you.
And population of 1. But Elvera mentioned something that's very important for Ireland, and that's, there were no jobs. So if you wanted a job, you got on the car ferry, because there were no planes to London unless you were a millionaire, and you got on the boat, you went to England, and you did a job, and it may not have been a glamorous job, and Elvera went over to work in a hotel. So, and Owen mentioned culture from England, Steve mentioned culture from England and America. So, like, where did you get kind of your pop culture fan sensibility from?
How far back do you want me to go? Well, I suppose, I've always been kind of more of a pop girly. Unlike Elvera, I definitely wasn't into sort of more hippie prog rock sort of, music. So definitely pre-punk in my teens, and I was in Wexford, and it was kind of a rural part of Wexford, so I wasn't in a town. So I didn't get to go out 4 nights a week. I barely went out at all. So I listened to the radio, and by about 76, I suppose, when punk was breaking, I managed to pick up John Peel, We were lucky in Wexford because we were right on the coast, so you could get the signal, which I know you mightn't have been able to do in Dublin. It was probably one of the few compensatory things about living where I lived. But prior, I guess, to punk happening and sort of discovering all of that, I was definitely more of a, I suppose, glam rock person. You know, just liked all, like T-Rex, liked Slade, liked Bowie. And definitely more a pop person than like even an albums person. I think that may have been down to like being the eldest and not having an older brother, because I know most people who were into the more prog rocky things, they had older siblings, and generally they were brothers. I mean, if they had an older sister, then they were into folk. I'm generalizing wildly, and sorry, I don't mean to insult anyone. So I suppose by the time 76 came along, Peel had started playing, and I was very into reggae as well. I was very into like, particularly ska, but any reggae really, and Peel was playing a lot of, like, he was playing dub, and he was playing, I guess, a lot of the stuff that was also been played in the punk clubs in between sets, because they didn't really have any punk records. So I really liked reggae. So it was pop, glam, reggae were my kind of roots before punk came along. Then I suppose by 76 I started hearing, particularly the Ramones actually. I think they had probably had a record out for anybody else, for any of the UK bands, or any of the what I would call the classic first wave of UK bands. So I really liked those. So I suppose that sort of motivated to getting onto the sort of going away to work. I think there was an advertisement for summer workers or casual workers in a hotel in London, but it wasn't as glamorous as the hotel you were in, Elvera. It was just a very bog standard. I'm not sure how many stars. I'm going to say, well, maybe 3. I don't think they had stars. 3 stars. And it was just very package tours, Greek package tours, I think, they seemed to be the main clientele. But it was my opportunity to get to London and have a job, and they provided accommodation. And I'm not sure why they recruited in Ireland, like Irish students, because the rest of the people working in the hotel, the chambermaids, were all from the Philippines. They were all much older than us and very much more capable, frankly, than we were. So I'm not sure what they were getting by employing Irish students, because we were frankly rubbish. Well, I was anyway. I wasn't very good at cleaning a room or doing any of the things you were supposed to. But it was a way to, I suppose, be in London. By that stage, I knew that was where I really, really wanted to go to London to see bands there. And very luckily, working in the hotel, working in the staff canteen, was this guy called Richard. And he was a gay guy. I thought he was ancient. He was 25, and he was he was a punk. You know, he looked like a punk. He had styled his kitchen KP uniform with safety pins. So I just kind of basically glommed onto this guy and was like, take me where you're going. And yeah, he just brought me to like all the gigs. I mean, I went to the Roxy a couple of times, but the Roxy was starting to kind of wind down at that point. And then it was mainly the Vortex, but, you know, went to anything that was happening that we could get to, you know. So Marquee, Music Machine, you know, all through that summer of 1977. So yeah, sorry, was that that was my trajectory to that point?
Yeah, but perfect trajectory to question 2 about, you were one of the very few Irish people, arguably one of the only Irish women, to have had an eyewitness view of what was happening in London. Some of us were reading about it, some of us were hearing school friends who had heard something and something else. But it seemed very, very far away. It seemed very remote. And like, what was it like? What was your experience or your memory?
Well, that's funny, because I guess when I was still living in Wexford, Dublin seemed almost as remote as London did. And even to get to Dublin and then kind of have that opportunity to just get to London in the summer of 77 was just, I mean, it was an opportunity, but it was only an opportunity because I actually saw it and went, brilliant, I can go to London, I can see bands. So yeah, it was incredible. I mean, again, you're not very conscious of the fact that you're experiencing or watching historic moments because you're just there having a great time. But I mean, I didn't see several of the really big names. In fact, the first time I saw The Clash was at that Trinity gig that was mentioned earlier, when they played, and that was because they were touring, I think, most of that summer. They weren't in London. And then the Pistols, the same. I think there was that thing, the GLC band, the Pistols, allegedly. I'm not really sure if that was what had happened, but that's what we were told, that no venues would put them on because of their reputation. But I mean, I got to see like X-Ray Specs, Susie, very early Susie and the Banshees, very early Adam Ants, who supported Susie and the Banshees. Who else? Penetration, whom I loved. The Slits a couple of times, who were major, obviously. Subway Sect. Trying to remember others. Wayne County, amazing. Just
wow.
pre his transition to Jane, loved him. And I think again, having Richard, this guy to hang around with, he was a little bit older and he was also gay. His sensibilities around punk, like I sort of absorbed those, so they weren't necessarily the kind of very straight sensibilities either. So I think I was just very lucky in whom I ended up finding as a pal over there, you know. So
And for a summer, you saw a lot of kind of the women who, you know, have been mythologized, but you saw them really early on. Were they striking? Were they
incredibly so? I mean, the Slits were just like nothing else you'd ever seen, and were just like a brilliant sort of assault on the senses, and they were just incredible on stage. Susie had just this amazing aura and this amazing intensity, and I remember my friend Richard saying, like, I wanted to go up and, you know, tell her, you know, she was great, but I'm too scared. So she definitely had that sort of slightly, you know, intimidating demeanour. Pauline, Penetration, yeah, just like they were incredible performers, but also musically amazing. Like the Slits, particularly, obviously musically, just like no one else I'd seen at that point. And they were even very different from a lot of the sort of standard punk bands. Yeah, it was extraordinary. But yeah, I probably sought out a lot of the bands with women in it as well, but they were just who was playing, and there were a lot of women at that point, or like that, and then probably subsequent couple of years as well. But yeah.
And then summer ended, and you came back to Dublin. The Dublin
I was
scene.
torn. I almost stayed. I'm kind of glad I didn't stay, but yeah, it was touch and go for a while. I was very, I could have stayed. And it was interesting then coming back to Dublin, where I hadn't really experienced, and in fact I'd missed the Radiators because I wasn't one of these, you know, people I knew later who were all like in secondary school and, you know, bunking off to see them at age 16, and I was stuck down in Wexford. I wasn't seeing anybody. But there were, I suppose very slowly I started kind of easing my way into sort of finding things. I mean, that Clash gig was definitely like a crucible, like it was mentioned before. It was one of those where you met, even if you didn't know the people then, they were all the people that you subsequently ended up being friends with. And also then I suppose a little later was the Dark Space, which was around this time of year actually, in 78, in February. That was amazing too, and that's why I met Des O'Byrne there, and he's obviously he was starting the Letters, I think around that time, that eventually we were in the Horde together. But yeah, so it was it was kind of feeling your way. Like, I'm not even sure how I found out about these things or these gigs. Fanzines, maybe hot press, word of mouth. I missed a lot of the great gigs that were on in Belfield that summer, though, unfortunately. That was one of the things I did miss. But yeah, I suppose when I came back, there were things like in the stadium. Like, I probably went to things in Dublin that I mightn't have necessarily gone to if I'd been in London with way more choice. But I went to everything that was even punk adjacent, or, you know, sort of second wave, or, you know, post-punk, because there was less of it. So yeah, I remember I went to Mink DeVille in the stadium, and I didn't know anyone. And then later, some guys, like about a week later, some guys on the street were like, "You were at Mink DeVille." It's kind of, you know, it was a weird one, and that's how you kind of got to meet like-minded people, I guess. And by that stage, I was in Belfield, but I mean, there was really very little happening in terms of punk there. But there were some people in Trinity whom I had got to know through that gig, the Clash gig, and then subsequently, I suppose, at Dark Space. So I ended up doing a lot of bunking off and going into town and going to Trinity, and then going to gigs in Trinity, a lot of which Elvera would have put on, I guess, and some of those in McGonagall's as well. So Yeah, it was a different transition though, because I remember going to something like there was a Revolver played the spinning wheel, and I literally didn't know anybody, and I just went along, kind of stood there, terrified. Not terrified of, just socially anxious. Not terrified of the bands or terrified of the people, just feeling like horribly conspicuous. But so you sort of did go to everything because there was less of it, and then you just sought it out and you went to it. Yeah. And Boy Scouts, I guess, as well, saw them play. And like the Bagot, there were a few venues, but not as many as you'd like.
Yeah, and that was very distinctive about the Dublin scene, was you went to anything, you mentioned punk adjacent, but it'd be punk adjacent. Like anyone who looked like they'd heard a Sex Pistols record, you don't see. But
pretty much, yeah.
You spoke on that radio documentary, about the style, the fashion, that it wasn't a uniform. Like, what do you remember people wearing?
Uniform. I mentioned the friend that I made in the hotel. He not only styled his KP uniform with safety pins and badges, but he wore those same clothes to the gigs. So it was much more DIY, and there was a sort of an aesthetic, but it was something that you could follow in your own way. There was definitely no rigorous rules, and it was almost pre-Mohawk. I mean, a few people had mohawks or little mohawks, but the classic punk style that I think people know now was really like about to evolve, but hadn't started properly. I remember going to Lawrence Corner to buy combats and then having to try and take them in, and like I'm terrible at sewing and all of that, so I like stapled them into drain pipes and then could barely get my foot in. And then a lot of it was just like secondhand clothes shops and just shredding things, safety pinning things, badges, and makeup as well. Like obviously Susie's makeup was kind of very influential, and men and women, everybody, like there was a definitely aesthetic where you could sort of go all out and just go mad with makeup, lots of dark liner. Very little, nobody bought new clothes, and there weren't any clothes that you could buy in the high street shops because they were still almost like hippie clothes, by comparison. So it was a very kind of, I remember Polystyrene worked in the Beaufort Market on the King's Road. Very briefly, I remember going in and kind of going, oh, it's Polystyrene, she's working here? And I don't think but I bought a pair of the suede winkle picker boots that I think were like vintage. I think they were probably from the 50s or something, or 60s, and bought them there from her. But it was a sort of figure it out as you went along and dress the way you wanted within certain, like no flares. But yeah, it was quite different. And even a year later, it had become much more sort of homogenous in a way. But definitely not in that period when I was there. Very, a lot more creativity going on maybe.
Fantastic. Bernie Furlong, thank you so much. Okay.